Okay, so today we're going to talk about how all of these machines that you've learned the safety about, how all of them work in conjunction with each other. I know we've talked about the function of each machine and how to safely and properly use it, um, but we have to understand like their relationship with each other. We're talking about the miter saw, the table saw, the joiner, the planer. We need to understand how they all get used in conjunction with each other before we can really start building our project. And I get a lot of questions. We've covered the safety, we've covered safety proper use, but then we get the questions, how do I turn this board into the board I want? Okay. Or they say, my plan calls for a 13-inch wide board, and this isn't wide. You don't have any boards wide enough, so what do I do? This is a very important part of your project building process. Okay. So we're going to go through this step by step. All right. And we're going to pick a number here. Basically, I know that we've got, let's say that we have a kid that needs a 12 by 24 panel out of this material, okay? So if your cut list says you need a 24-inch board, and we're going to start at the miter saw, and we're talking about a board that this has been planed both sides, and it has two rough edges. Just about every type of hardwood we get is going to be of that variety. Two smooth faces and two rough edges, okay? If it has a rough edge, it means we can't cut it squarely to length yet. You have to have a true edge before you can cut your ends, okay? Now, so if we're asking, if your cut list says, if your cut list specifies that you need a piece that's 24 inches long, then we're going to cut to rough length on the miter saw first. That's the first step. We're cutting to rough length, cross cut. Okay, and so we know this board isn't wide enough to make a 12-inch wide board. I'm going to show you how we're going to cut boards and make that board. Okay, so first thing, got a really jagged end here. We're going to clean that up with the miter saw. I don't need a mark. It is important to note, though, when you're using the miter saw and you've got a rough edge, you need to make sure, and we covered this in safety, and kids struggle with this at times, you've got to make sure the board is touching the fence at the cut and the table at the cut. If you have a gap between the board and the fence, you're going to have a kickback. If you have a gap between the table and the board, you're going to have a kickback. We can rearrange the board on the miter saw so to prevent that kickback, but you have to understand how that works. Okay. So I've got everything. There's no threat of kickback there. I've cleaned up the end. We need a 24-inch board. Basically what that means is we're going to cut a board. I always go about an inch, okay? An inch of waste. So I'm making a rough cut. This is my first step in making a panel, okay? Tight at the fence. I've got to mark at 25 inches instead of 24. This is rough, what we call rough length. Later in the process of making our panel, you don't want to treat either one of these ends as if it's a square end. You need to remember that was a rough cut end, okay? We're going to do it again. Okay, mark at 25. Okay, there. So I've got a couple pieces. Now I have enough boards to make a 12 by 24 panel. Okay, I'll load up my stuff here. And now this is going to be a little choppy because I got to move you around the shop to the different machines. Okay, so now we're going to take care of those rough edges, okay? And we're going to do that with the joiner. Got my joiner set. I'm going to check all my settings. And what I'm doing, I'm joining one edge on each board. Never joint both edges, just joint one edge, okay? Okay, I'm going to inspect that. Sounds like a good cut. That's a nice square cut throughout the length of the board. Set it over here on the table saw. And I'm going to join that edge on my next piece. Okay. So we've got one edge jointed on both pieces. We're rolling over here to the table saw, because that's just how we roll. Now, get you in here where you can see. Okay. All right, so we're going to make our adjustments here. You just need to assume that you're going to have to make some sort of adjustments when you get to your machine. Okay. We cut different thicknesses. Someone was making a narrow strip, which meant we had to raise the blade clear up. We want to get that down to within 1/8 inch above the top of the board, right there. I'm going to lock it in place. Now, we don't want to make our panel of real wide boards. Real wide boards are prone to cupping, and we don't want that. We can make a much more stable panel by gluing narrower boards together. And so what we're going to do is this for demonstration purposes, and you really need to think about, you know, when you're making your panel, what width you want to cut to minimize waste. Okay, and you also need to think about, okay, well, what is the target width of my finished panel? We need to think about that. Okay, so what I'm going to do, usually all brick pieces anywhere from 2 to 3 inches wide, and glue those together, and that makes a nice stable panel. Okay, so what I'm going to do, normally I would have an assistant be here to check these pieces. I can't do that right now. Rip the second edge after we've jointed the first one is because if you have a board with 2 rough sawn edges and you joint both edges, you'll have 2 true edges that are not necessarily parallel with each other. And it's easy to get confused about, it's just not a good situation. If you flip the board over when you're making your end cuts, you could end up with ends that aren't square. So I always rip the second edge on the board. Not sure if I'll get another one or not here. Not quite. Okay, so I've got plenty of pieces here to make my 12 inch by 24 inch panel. this is one of the panels that I cut, or one of the boards that I cut. It's got a pretty unstable knot, but we have extra pieces. We're able to, you know, kick that one out and use a better one. I would advise, take all your pieces with you, even the pieces you don't think you need, and keep it with your project until you've ultimately decided you don't need them. Okay, you might be able to use those elsewhere in your project. Okay, so now then, we've got all these pieces ready to make into a panel. Now we're going to go to our glue table. Okay. So now we've got, basically, I've got 6 pieces here that are 2 inches wide. And those are going to make a 12-inch wide panel. And I'm also about to show you why we cut to rough length and not finished length at the miter saw initially. I believe I may have hit on this in another video, but what I'm doing is I'm marking end grain so that I can see the grain direction. I don't want to repeat. A lot of these boards were cut out of the same board, and if we glue them together as they came out of the board, then that board can kind of take on a different shape according to the growth patterns in the wood. And so what I'm doing is I'm just marking these growth rings, and I'll show you here in a second. Okay. Okay, so we'll bring you around here. All right. So if you look here, okay, it's gonna be hard to see on video, I know, but we've got, you can see the mark I made on that, okay? And so what I'm doing is I'm gonna arrange these boards so that this growth pattern does not repeat itself. Okay, so let me get you closer there. You see that, okay? What I've done is I've arranged these growth rings so we had a lot of variation there. What that's gonna do is help this panel to stay straight, okay? If we alternate those grain patterns, you'll end up with a straighter panel over time. I'm whipping these up all the same direction except the back one, putting that one backwards. And we're going to go 100% glue coverage here. A little ketchup bottle's plugged here. A lot of kids, the first time they do this, they are astounded at the amount of glue we use. But I would say that we have very few glue failures. It's better to use too much than not enough. You need 100% glue coverage. We're going to use this little glue brush here, little disposable brush, so that we can wash them out and use them again. Okay, so I'm going for 100% coverage here. Okay, that's done. And I mean, you want to get clear out to all the corners. You don't want any ends or corners or edges that are left dry, which I see commonly. 100% glue coverage. Okay. Now, we're going to flip going to reverse. We're going to flip them all down. They're the exact reverse of what we did flipping them up. So this all goes like this. Okay. Clamps up. So I have an inch of extra length built into this panel, but I want to try to line up the ends best I can. You know, this is why we don't cut the finished length the first time on the miter saw. You always cut to a rough length so that we can glue the panel together. And then once it's dried, once this is dry, we're going to scrape the glue. We can plane it. We can send it through the panel sander. We can cut both ends now that we have a true edge, okay? And we can cut that panel to finished size. You can only cut the panel to finished size, the board to finished size, after you put it into the panel, okay? And so the whole purpose of this video is to show you like the relationship between the miter saw, the joiner, the table saw, and this, so that you can see what order we need to do things. Okay, so I'm giving just a little bit of tension on the clamps here, making sure it doesn't move, try to keep everything in place. And then before I just get crazy tight with that, I'm going to take the rubber mallet, and because these clamps have a tendency to like pull that panel up at the edge. When you see that moving down, tapping that down the corner, we want to make sure everything is as flat as possible. And then we want to put sufficient clamp pressure on this, okay? You don't need to crush the wood, but we should see glue, you know, squeezing out the entire length of the glue joint, okay? The only thing left to do that I would do is take a wet rag, wipe up all the excess glue on the top, and that'll save you work once this panel's glued up. In theory, about 20 minutes in the clamps is sufficient, but usually I tell kids, if they've glued up a panel, try to leave it overnight and take it out the next day in class. So there's your panel, ready to cut the ends on and ready to cut to finished length, ready to plane, ready to sand, ready to assemble into